Thank you, everyone, for joining Identity 2025. I am here today with an esteemed panel of experts to talk about universal IDs and numbers, insights from the Bidstream and bid request.
Yeah, hi there. My name is Matt Davis. I'm Director of Solution Consulting at BidSwitch with a remit towards addressability. My role for the last many months has been to bring in identity solutions and strategies around the identity solution for where BidSwitch, when it sits in the middle, it's providing solutions for both SSPs and DSPs and seeing, more importantly, we see what others are trading through us rather than necessarily what we're doing. But yeah.
Great. Jamie Penkethman, product marketing lead for data and addressability at Equative. And one of our major initiatives right now is to make buying of alternative IDs easier. It is easy via third-party data. And we see a lot of opportunity there for buyers to get that incremental scale in Safari and Firefox by targeting the IDs via an audience segment. So we're working to provide education to the market on that and make it easier for our users to find those opportunities.
Great. All right. Well, thank you both for being here. I think, to start, wanted to do a little bit of a level set on the current state of universal ID coverage. Matt, I know you recently shared some stats with us about the presence of universal IDs in the Bidstream, which we have here today. So Matt, if you wanted to just walk us through the data that you have shared here.
Yeah, the data we shared here is just overview of what we see in the open exchange stuff. Obviously, from the back of it, there's some useful information on the different browsers, and you can see different browsers have different levels of coverage for like universal IDs in general, and more importantly, like cookie IDs. So I've added here like the cookie IDs where there's simply no ID in the presence and a variety of different ID providers. Obviously, ID5 we've put the name on there, and the rest of them are different ID providers, but they should be the same ones across the board for different things. So what we're seeing is in Chrome, obviously there's a very large proportion of cookie IDs, 70-80% still in website traffic in Chrome, which has IDs. But we're still seeing good coverage of other universal IDs. Some of it are potentially tied to the cookie as well. Some of it are obviously standard universal IDs that we see kind of across the board. But when you look at Safari and Firefox, you see that there's still really good coverage, not necessarily of cookie IDs. Cookie IDs go down to like maybe 10 or 15% or wherever it is, but there's still good individual coverage across the board of IDs that are coming through. Like I pulled this data 6 to 8 months ago for another presentation, and this is current data. So this is data that we pulled in the last couple of days for January. When I pulled this same data 6 months ago, the coverage is much higher now across the board than it was back even only 6 months ago. So we're seeing universal ID coverages grow quite substantially in the requests as well. Things like ID5 on its own covers like 40% of Safari, other partners across the board, and it's not the same. So like one of the things I put in here is when there's no ID, there's like less than 30% of requests have no ID of any kind. That means that there's across the board coverage, but not necessarily the same IDs on every request, but you see multiple IDs across multiple requests and so on and so forth. And we're starting to see a little bit of uplift on the back of like open exchange coverage, where certain DSPs, certain providers, certain buyers are seeing uplift across the board. Like when an ID is present, there is uplift like that we see across the board, but like specific IDs, when specific IDs are present, you see an increase in CPM, you see an increase in spend, specifically in standard A/B testing across the board. But it's still low for open exchange. Partially the reason is from what our conversations is that a lot of DSPs are listening but not decisioning on the back of open IDs yet, and I think in part that's because they're still tied to like the idea that Chrome hasn't deprecated cookies, so we're still okay. But from what we can see, that's probably a little bit short-sighted to take a look at that. And if you look in terms of Safari and Firefox, we see other partners that are taking advantage of that as well in OpenRTB, because from what we can see, if you have any strategies related to universal IDs in Safari and Firefox, you can pull them now, and they will still apply to Chrome once Chrome is ready as well. I think I've spoken a lot here, and I want to see what Jamie has to say as well at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with so much of what you said, particularly about, DSPs are listening, but the question is, are they actually buying? My point of view is that we don't see the buying on alternative IDs that we should see. I think there's a number of reasons why that's happening. And that goes to your other point. Everyone's fixated on what Google is going to do, which is true. Like 5 years ago, everyone was fixated on like solving for match rates and solving for cookies going away in Safari. But then Google said cookies were going away in Chrome. Everyone forgot about everything else. So alternative IDs has become this thing that sits in the mind of people about being about the future. And if Google delays their plans, then everyone else can delay their plans. And that is absolutely the wrong way of thinking. Right now, about 40%, depending on global region, between 35 and 40%, up to 50% of consumers are not in Chrome. That's a huge size. That's a huge customer base there. And, it's really surprising that people aren't thinking about trying to reach that group. But I think really that's what happened. Just like, Chrome, everyone worried about Chrome. They forgot about all these customers and just really stopped trying to target them in audiences. The second thing is that there's a perception that the workflow for using alternative IDs it takes a lot of time, and that time might not justify the scale you get. That could be true. That could certainly be true for retargeting, where, you have to do things on the brand site and you have to do things with pixels. It could be true with first-party data where there's an onboarding process. But with third-party data, there's no major workflow. There's some thinking, there's some thoughtful planning, but that's planning that has the potential to add value. And then the third part is, we're guilty as a company right now of this, is that platforms in general, it's the feedback I get, the platforms aren't doing a good job of making it obvious to the user where that scale sits via third-party audience segments targeting Safari and Chrome. It's not super clear in the UIs. And, I can, take the mea culpa here. We've done this and we're working to fix that. And it should be fixed too. But I think when users of platforms just can see right in front of them that if they use this third-party data segment and see the scale they're getting via an alternative ID in a cookieless browser, they're going to be like, wow, that's incredible. And then they'll start buying.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, I think, all great points here. I want to go back to Matt for 1 second and ask a question, because I noticed, well, there is still a large percentage of cookies present within Chrome. Curious, while Google has not officially deprecated cookies, have you seen that start to deteriorate? Have you seen that number start to go down, or not quite yet?
Not quite yet in volume. We have, obviously, at Bidswitch, we have a lot of good technology to try and maintain the cookies as best we possibly can, and we start to see there are a variety of ways of trying to maintain that, because as a provider of requests coming through and being an intermediary rather than necessarily being the publisher or the SSP or the DSP, we're simply passing that on. We can see that it is slightly going down, but not by much yet. Having said that, we can definitely see the increase of IDs pretty much every day. All the other alternative IDs that come on the back of that on a regular basis. But I can see that starting to go down very quickly. But again, it's all dependent on whether like what Chrome decide to do. Like, and that's obviously dependent on other factors that are not necessarily directly in Chrome's hand as well. We've obviously everything else that's going on with like protected audience, privacy sandbox, and that kind of stuff as well. It's all tied in together, but that could change very quickly. And we're planning on the basis that if it is not changing yet, that doesn't mean it's never going to change. Like, and that it's going to change when it does quickly and fairly rapidly. In the grand scheme of things, over like say a 6-month or 12-month period, that will change dramatically as well. But the beauty about it is, and the way we're thinking is that in Safari and Firefox, you've got a environment that's at that end goal state already. And anything that you can do, like right now, if you want to test your solutions, you want to test what you can do in open auction, target Safari, target Firefox. One, they're great browsers and they have a huge amount of audience and they've got great scale as well. But also anything that you do there to get that coverage, you can then apply to Chrome at a later stage and look at any of these test strategies to do that. And there's a variety of strategies that you can do through looking at a particular universal ID, to having a range of universal IDs, to creating a user graph, for example, internally that allows you to then build, if you see one or this or that or the other, you can identify that as your user, for example, as well. Or you can then just tie it through third-party data into segments and audiences and stuff like that as well. Although that tends to be more deal orientated, it can also apply in open auction trading as well, which still covers substantial amounts of programmatic trading from what we can see.
Great. Okay. So word to the wise is, start testing now, start preparing. Don't wait for cookies to completely go away. Leverage, other browsers to do some testing. And I think, that's a nice segue, to take a look at. Jamie, I know you had shared, and I'll pop up on the screen here in a second, but just some data to support that, and kind of what you guys are seeing so far as folks are trying to do some of that testing, what the KPIs look like, and just kind of the guidance you would give to folks that are starting that testing process now, and any other thoughts that you want to share on that. So let me pop open your data. Okay, I think it's up there. So go ahead and talk through that a little bit.
So this is, the second part of the opportunity, right? When I talked about cookieless browsers, between 35 and 50% of consumers are not in Chrome. So that's opportunity number one, is to reach this audience that, you as a marketer likely haven't been trying to reach. The second opportunity is you have lower CPMs, right? So this is looking over the fourth quarter of last year with September in there, just as a point of comparison, and looking at the average effective CPM in Chrome versus Safari and Firefox. In the fourth quarter, on average, that's about 36% cheaper than it is in Chrome. So I think that combination of what I would argue is incremental reach at a lower CPM, 35% lower. This is for in-stream and outstream video. In my mind, I don't see, how one can make a good case not to intentionally go after these browsers. And again, it's easy with third-party data.
Sure. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about fill rates and eCPMs when these alternative IDs are used. This first one being taking a look at examples leveraging ID5 IDs.
Yep. So this is ID5 when we're looking at Safari and Firefox, when ID5 is the only ID in the impression. So, that does bias the sample a little bit, right? Because I work for an SSP. So, IDs, they exist in the Bidstream, but you don't buy the ID. You always buy the ID as a function of its place in an audience segment. We don't have any view into what audiences are being used and what identifiers triggering the bid. So to kind of zoom in on like the performance of one ID, we have to exclude all the others, which, that creates a limited sample set, which can create some randomness and some variability. But what we see here is what you would expect to see, right? Like if you're doing audience targeting, that impression is more valuable because you can target a demo, you can target an SUV buyer, or you can target your first party data. You can target a characteristic that's really, really important to the marketer, and that impression will be worth more, so bidding will be more competitive. We see that realized in this chart here for ID5, right? We see, if you look at the orange line, at the top, it's fill rates. Fill rates are higher when ID5 is the only ID in the impression. And the effective CPM, 2 out of 3 months, is higher. No, I think 2 out of 3 months is positive, but you're like, well, why would it be lower that third month? That kind of doesn't make sense. And then now I want to look at the same chart for 2 other IDs, 2 other leading IDs. They'll be unnamed for now. And then we see things that are like really even more counterintuitive. Remember, orange is the alternative ID. So we see fill rates like being really, really high, but then we see the CPM actually being lower than when there is like no ID in the impression. And you know, that doesn't make sense. And what I can say by doing these charts is that like you change a variable in the analysis and you know, metrics go all over the place. My conclusion, like the way I interpret the sum of this, is that there's just not a lot of intentional buying going on with IDs, right? If buyers were intentionally using audience segments with these identifiers, you wouldn't see a lower CPM when it's present. That's why we're seeing this variation in these counterintuitive responses. It's not that one ID is so much better at driving revenue for publishers. It's just that buying has been somewhat limited and we're getting a lot of randomness and variability in the results. So that is my takeaway. If there was a lot of buying, if everyone was using all the IDs in their audience segments, absolutely we would see higher effective CPMs when the ID is present.
Sure. Okay. So some potentially positive signals or, positive story here, but more to be learned, more, more buying behavior to be leveraged here. I think I'll flip to the next slide, let you share an example of how value can be leveraged, and then we can let Matt kind of weigh in. But let's take a look at the last example you had here, just to close this point out.
Yeah, and this is where I think things get really cool. And this is where I think, I said, oh, there's work, but it's not busy work. When you're using third-party data, it's not like busy work that you do. It's actually work where you as a trader or you as a planner can, if you do the right research, you can add a lot of value to your clients, and you can add a lot of like unexpected performance benefits to your campaign. So what I'm going to show is that these are 3 different IDs in the audience segments of 3 different providers. Like the way we do it is all of our audience segments can contain one alternative ID. So imagine you're targeting SUV shoppers. In this case, we've loaded up 3 different, SUV audiences from 3 different audience providers. Each provider uses a different alternative ID. That column with a percentage shows the percentage of total auctions that are in Safari and Firefox relative to the auctions in Chrome. And to me, those numbers are like really, really great, right? So for the first audience, we're seeing 20% of all the auctions are in Safari and Firefox. Think about it. Chrome has a 2 or 3 to 1 advantage in market share. Then the ID is about 30% scale and coverage and supply. So with those kind of disadvantages, we see the ID resolving at a really, really high rate in the audience segment. And what I am calling that 20% reach you're getting in Safari and Firefox via that one segment only, I'm calling that incremental reach because I'm assuming that the buyer has not made the effort to target that audience. And then what you can do is you can combine 3 different segments with 3 different IDs. Each of the IDs is going to have different IDs will have different footprints on supply, right? It's not going to be totally additive, but it's not going to be totally overlapped. So you can, by combining the footprints of 3 different ID providers within 3 different audiences, you can increase your cookieless reach a lot. And remember that CPM is a lot lower, 35% lower for in-stream, outstream. So you're reaching a person that you haven't reached before, a person that is less fatigued from targeted ads, and you're getting them at a much lower CPM at, I think, significant scale.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. No, love that example. Matt, would love your take. What do
And
you
it's
think
easy. I'll
when you
just say
see
it's
this?
easy.
It is easy if you can get the data sets and get those in. But even on OpenRTB, I think you're starting to see something similar to what you're saying. Like, it's difficult to identify and attribute it down to an individual ID. But when you look at it compared to there's no ID present, like on things like Safari and Firefox, you're seeing when there's no ID present, bid rates drop through the floor, CPMs drop through the floor at all, like completely anonymous. And obviously there are no cookied IDs, but in aggregate, when there is universal IDs present, you see at least a 2x or maybe even a 3x jump in like CPMs, bid rate, and so on and so forth. So somewhere down the line, DSPs are resolving this to something. Like, it's not just random that's coming in, and potentially they've got their own audiences and so on and so forth. But it takes more than that, and you need to look at it and start developing strategies to kind of do that, especially if you're a smaller or medium-sized DSP. Like, the Googles of the world probably have their own strategies lined out for years in advance, but the medium size, the smaller size, start working with Firefox, start working on Safari now, and look at universal IDs as a whole, and then figure out how to attribute it to individual IDs and which ones work best, and so on and so forth. Because you find that different IDs have different values. Some are much more narrow in their focus, probably have lower volume, but maybe slightly higher, more things to kind of look at that you can actually identify back to a particular user. Then there's others that have much greater coverage and still very good at doing that. And then there's others that do different IDs, and that combination can be very powerful in cookieless browsing and addressable solutions across the board. It's not just one ID to rule them all, as in that regards, but like a combination of them together. Yes. And work in value as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Matt, that's such a good point. That is not one ID to rule them all, because again, I think that's the perception. I think a lot of people are like, oh, which ID should I use? Which one should I choose? And to your point, it's not about choosing one. It's about finding ways to use all of them in conjunction with cookies.
Absolutely. I mean, and I would say even from, the ID5 side of things, that's the perspective that we would hold as well, right? Because I think there's certain things that our universal identifier can bring to the table that can be complementary to other IDs. At the end of the day, it's all about maximizing addressability, right? So however we get there, however we can, support the future, or the current state, I guess now it's not even of buying, I think is we're all vested in that goal. So I think, we talked a little bit about how the presence of universal IDs can influence bidding strategies. We've talked about how the IDs are there and demand is lagging. I know you guys have shared a little bit of perspective on that, but anything else you would add as far as like, I don't know, hypotheses on like, how do we get there? What will it take to have demand catch up with the supply when it comes to the availability of universal IDs?
I would say it's panels such as this one and some of the other content that you are putting out in the market, helping educate our ecosystem.
Education is key. Like if people know that there is alternative solutions out there, then that can really help. One of the other things that can really help is that very recently, and I mean literally in the last 3 months or so, the IAB released the ID provenance field, an update to the extended ID provider array, which is where all the universal IDs sit, and so on and so forth. So that now gives a lot more detail as to how and where and why that ID was generated and where it comes from and what the value is behind it and so on and so forth as well. So again, hopefully it means that DSPs will do the work now to update the logic so they can read this ID, but then also then go the next stage of being able to go, okay, well, I can decision against it and I can use that ID and I can not just listen, but actually go ahead and start to bid. And that's where things will get really interesting as well. And also, why not take advantage of the extra time you've got when cookies are around to cross-reference the data and see, does this match? Does this not?
And, and the other thing, like cookies are still around, but there's match rate issues, and I think 5 years ago, the biggest issue in our industry was like, oh, match rates are terrible. How do we solve for it? Oh, we'll create Digitrust. We'll create the Ad ID Consortium. We'll create Unified ID 1.0. And we got to solve for match rates. Like then, when LiveRamp's identifier came out as Identity Link, it was positioned as a match rate solution. Everyone forgot about match rates. Like you don't hear people speak about it that much. But again, alternative IDs, they do solve for the match rate issue too right now. So it's, and I think if you can, if you're buying an ID in an audience segment, like let's say hypothetically, you're targeting parameters cookieless, then when you do your reporting, you want to look at impressions in Chrome via cookieless targeting, and then you'll get a sense of what you're getting via match rate loss. So there's a couple of interesting angles there.
Yeah,
For sure.
definitely. All right. Well, I think we're almost at time here, but I did want to ask if you guys had any predictions, like if we could look 12 months down the road, what do you think? You've shared some data on the current state today. Any predictions on how we'll see, things transition moving forward?
It's a really good, really, really good question. I'm hoping, obviously not having a crystal ball, that there will be a move towards Firefox and Safari, and not necessarily away from Chrome, but as Chrome will have finally, well, first of all, 12 months down the line, we're hoping Chrome has finally made a decision based on whether they are going to deprecate cookies or not. And that process, I suspect, will have started in earnest. And then that will then rebalance across all different browsers, because that ultimately you're trying to find a user, and those users are across all different browsers and so on and so forth. And people will have found solutions to work with universal IDs, to work with even other systems like protected audience and privacy sandbox as well. And that whole combination together will be there, because fundamentally people are still needing to advertise. Their buyers are still wanting to target things, and we should see we're well on the way towards that solution. If we come back together again in a year's time, I think we'll be well on the way to that solution. I can see where we were 12 months ago. Everyone was just starting to get into that kind of, oh, this is going to happen this year, and it wasn't. And so people may think that may be the case, but I really believe we'll be well on the way this time next year.
Yeah, I absolutely share that hope, and I'm also cautiously optimistic that I would predict that as well. And to echo one of our earlier points that we discussed right now is that again, a hope prediction is that the industry moves past thinking of like alternative IDs as this like replacement for cookies, or that it's about one alternative ID versus another alternative ID, and everything is this like choice of one. And the hope is that we begin to think about alternative IDs and cookies as these things that work together, almost like a partnership. And we do see that today. We see that in many different solution types. And we saw that in the example with like how you can combine 3 different audience segments. But we see it in solutions such as like meta graphs or cross ID graphs, which exist. We see it with ID bridging, which is kind of an application of cookies and IDs forming a solution. So I think more and more, that will hopefully become the way people think of these identifiers.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot a little bit with those predictions. We won't hold you to them, but I think it's a optimistic view of the future, and I think there's examples of your folks like yourself that are not waiting for the future. You're already acting it and looking towards it. So thank you both for your time. I appreciate the conversation and look forward to tracking this together and seeing where we go over the next 12 months.
Indeed. Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.